You're listening to Inside Public Procurement by Bonfire, a show celebrating the unique stories and heroic efforts of those on the front lines of public procurement. Each episode, we bring you the latest trends, tips, and real stories from procurement trailblazers like you, who work tirelessly to bring positive impact to the agencies and communities you serve. Together, let's elevate the field of public procurement to new heights. Now, pull up a chair and let's gather around the bonfire. Our show is about to begin.
Hello and welcome to the Inside Public Procurement Podcast. My name is Tung La and I am a client support agent over at Bonfire, an e-procurement solution used by over 500 public agencies in North America. I'm joined here today by Jeff Houtz from CSE, who is in the private engineering and construction sector. Hello, Jeff. How are you?
Hello, Tung. Good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, I want to ask you something before we get into things. And before we get into what CSC is, because I have questions on that too. We talked before about that you just went on a big road trip. You traveled for like 3 days. How was that?
In a lot of ways, glad it was over when it was over. One of those needing a vacation from your vacation. But we went to go see family up in the Northeast. I live in the Houston, Texas area. And it was a very long road trip. But if a person's patient and all, you get through it and enjoy and stop and smell the roses sometimes.
Do you have like a really comfy seat that you need to have for those types of road trips? Like kind of like a head massager as you're going?
So my wife is usually the one-arm neck massager that usually does pretty good. Pretty good for us when I can talk her into doing it, right?
Oh, yes. That's very key. Now, my last question about this road trip, because I'm very fascinated. I mean, like, that's a long, three days. That's a long time.
Each way, yeah.
Each way. Oh, right. Yes, of course. 3 days there, 3 days back. Right. That's a whole week. That's a lot of vacation time that you use just for driving on the road.
Exactly.
What is your number one piece of advice?
Fly. I was about to say if we're going to fly next time for sure too, but there's the see it both ways is, if you're driving and you can take advantage of stopping and taking your time, there's benefit in that too, as there is benefit in flying and getting there really fast to spend more time with your destination. So yeah, right. But it's all about priorities. Yeah. That's
right. Okay. And if I were to make a 3-day road trip, what should I do to mentally prepare myself?
I guess mentally be ready for being exhausted because it's inevitable. And if you're good with that, then you're not stressed by that, right?
Okay. All right. I'll keep that in mind. Jeff, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what you do. You say you're from CSC. You're in the private engineering and construction sector. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the brief bio goes like 30 years in supply chain at a global major engineering, procurement, and construction contractor. The name is Fluor, F-L-U-O-R. Many know it as one of the largest contractors in the world. And I found my home in supply chain through a whole career there. About a year and a half ago, right as COVID was getting bad and the oil price was crashing, I made the interesting decision to launch a consultancy, which is CSC. It stands for Constructing Supply Change. And I launched it as an LLC, have some partners, and our goal is to basically elevate and amplify supply chain as a function and as a work process in the big construction project space across industries. So it's going to be interesting to talk about public versus private here because my former employer is also a government contractor and has since long before I ever joined 32 years ago. My first project ever at Fluor was for the U.S. Department of State and the Army Corps of Engineers. We were rebuilding buildings, turning them into embassies in the former Soviet Union CIS region, think Moldova and Ukraine and those countries. So that was a public sector job that was my first real assignment. And so I guess I've always had some insight as to the similarities and differences across industries because of the separation that my former company had always kept the groups being because of acquisition regulations. And one group says they're a specialty and can't take people from the other side. And this is what we'll talk about, I think, about Bonfire here too, and why in my new consultancy's role, partnering with another consultancy focused on project management and engineering. We are the customer now of Bonfire, and our approach in partnership is to go chase the mining industry globally and carving out scope and doing supply chain services for them better than any other contractor can. And we've chosen Bonfire as a way to evaluate and transact and score and do all the needful evaluation work. So we'll talk about that in this podcast, but that's sort of the history of what we're doing now to raise our function and our role on projects to be much more than just a transaction.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I'd like to also hear a little bit of the history of Jeff Houtz here. How did you start in procurement from the beginning? We've talked about this in every single episode now because I find it such a fascinating question where people don't even know what procurement is before they get a job in it. How did it all start for you?
That's a great question, because we are a function, whether it's public or private, we're a function that is more of a generalist function than a lot of the engineering or other disciplines. For me, like many, was not my field of study. If I knew then what I would be doing for a career, I would have majored in international business and all of that. And now there's supply chain, of course, degree programs. People listening to this will, of course, know that. But many supply chain programs, master's level and even doctoral level. Well, I was going to be a lawyer. That was my goal. And so I took a pre-law degree, changed my mind at the last minute because I was young and didn't think I wanted that anymore. As we all do. Totally did a 180. Got into a couple of 3 schools and everything, but I just said, I don't want this after all. So I found a home at a construction job site in Southern California where I had been living and liked it because I could relate to it somehow and I could see something getting built and contributing to the success of a project. And I could see that and I could relate somehow. And so I found my way to the company's headquarters, which at the time were up in Orange County, California, and began a career, began moving around, taking assignments, went international, and still could relate to it. I like to think of myself as sort of a modern-minded person, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing now is much more than just being a really good buyer. We're all trained to do that, of course, and negotiator and all the stuff that we do. But I always believe that we should do as much or more than is asked of us and contribute much more and contribute to strategy and all of that. So that is how it turned from way back then to now, still believing in what we do. I couldn't believe any more in what we do. And so I want to keep doing that just as long as I'm able. And I got quite a few years left. So we're going to keep on trucking.
I love that so much. And, before we get into the meat of the topics today, some of our audience might go, wait a second, Jeff just said he's in the private sector now. I thought this was the Inside Public Procurement podcast. This is what's happening for this It's okay. Jeff has, obviously, he just mentioned he has experience working in both. And I really want to do today's episode because I thought it'd be interesting to compare and contrast private versus public sector. Because I'll be honest with you, I've been in the procurement field myself as a client support agent for about 2 years now. And I had a very hard time understanding the differences between private and public. And good thing Jeff is a big expert on both. So Jeff, do you want to give an explanation of what the differences between the two are?
Sure. I'm glad we'll get a lot of chances in this conversation to compare and contrast and do away with maybe some misconceptions that one of those, you could summarize it, I guess. So in the public sector, it's full of bureaucracy and a bunch of people that don't know what they're talking about, making rules about how procurement should happen. Hence, it's able, what are some of the crazy stories about, $5,000 hammers in the military getting bought and all of those things governed by rules that are just crazy and large and overbearing versus private sector, non-government, I'd like to call them. Basically, it's a free-for-all. We can do whatever we want. There's no controls. Ethics may be in question. And I'd like to say sort of no to both of those things because as procurement professionals, and we'll get into Bonfire and why we selected Bonfire for what we're doing. But as procurement professionals, we're bound by legal and ethical standards, regardless of being public or private. And so from my private, non-public, non-government background across industries, I worked in energy and oil and gas and mining and power and all these other industries. I saw very little difference except the municipality and government controls that are acquisition regulations that the people in the audience are bound by a lot of. It's still in the same theme or the same vein is maybe the right way to say that is those are there to guarantee fairness, right? And controls over ethics and legalities. So the private sector has the same thing too. Regardless of whether it's a government mandating that, other laws also around the world, and I've worked around the world, other laws and standards also regulate fairness and legality, gifts and gratuities and ethical standards and bribes and facilitating payments, and all of that stuff applies mostly to both public and private. So I think we'll get into some examples of that as we go, but I'm a big believer in there's more similarity than you'd think between business lines, public versus private, goods versus services, which we'll get into here in this talk, just strict PO buying versus contracting for services. But I see so much more similarity than difference. And I think as a maybe non-standard customer of Bonfire, there's reasons why we believed this would be really good for us because of its ability to be customized for the needs of a procurement, or the needs of a mining project versus going and building a new school or working on government services or overseas or, any of that. Much more similarity than difference, if that makes sense. And I think that's the theme that each of these parts of our discussion will take, including some, Bonfire functionality and how public sector uses Bonfire, a tool, and conducts their business. We could talk to how those are very similar in public and in private.
Absolutely. I think you just have a really great perspective, Jeff, and I can't wait to dive a little deeper into this with you. So let's go ahead and get started with our next question, which is, in your experience in the private sector, which is non-municipal and non-government, specifically in the bioengineering and construction space, what philosophy is usually taken by owners and contractors when evaluating proposals for goods and services? And is this philosophy different in the public sector?
I believe that, I'll start off with what I believe in. I believe in evaluations for the procurement of goods and services both should be focused more on other than just price and delivery and schedule and lead time, and more on other evaluation factors. And I'll always keep pressing for there to be much more about things besides just price and delivery and price and schedule. I think we get a bad rap as a function when we only focus on price and delivery, the whole same old saying, 3 or 6 or 10 bids in a cloud of dust makes the best procurement. I usually say that's just not true. And every time that I've done root cause analysis work in my career to try to figure out why something went wrong, it's because we were this mindless 3 bids and a buy, who cares as long as they're cheap. And I think that's a mistake no matter what industry or type of sector that you're working. So it was interesting looking at some of the dashboard data that's available to us as a Bonfire customer, because my mentality going in when thinking about public sector procurement was there was much less fully performed evaluations, and it was more about price and lead time because those are the controls that the government puts on people, on organizations. But what I found was that the instructions to bidders and the RFQ, RFP documentation that's used by your customers, some of the audience of this podcast, are very similar to those found in private sector. Perhaps a bit more lengthy, which is good. That's, it's good to be lengthy because you're making it clear that you're after more than just price and lead time and price and schedule. But here again, I was brought to school a little bit too, is it's not as simple as just price and schedule, either in public or private. The more that we go beyond just initial price, the more positive the procurement will be, and the happier I think both sides will be in the fulfillment of that procurement. So again, another similarity that I found, and that's sort of the summary of what I've seen in this space so far, whether it's municipal government or not.
Yeah. You already started touching upon the prices versus non-price, but can you tell us a little bit more about the price versus non-price evaluation factors and weighting when making decisions in the private sector and how that compares to the public?
Yeah, I believe that, and from what I've seen within the tool, is the ability of Bonfire to include a whole wide swath of different evaluation factors, customizable evaluation factors, is a good prodding to supply chain professionals that they can and should include more soft costs, even hard to quantify costs, or in some cases, impossible to quantify costs that should have an effect on deciding who you need to buy from. And so while I'm pleased to see that that functionality is in Bonfire because your customers have asked for it, sort of pause for effect. This is how software works, right? You wouldn't have functionality unless somebody asked for that to happen. And if your main customer base is public, great that they've gone down this path of needing all those other weighted factors. Well, I love it. In the procurement of services, there should be more non-price, non-cost evaluation factors. And that's proven true from the data that you've shown me and we've talked about. There's much more of those evaluation factors in services procurement than goods. Makes sense to the audience, right? I mean, there's only so much that you could evaluate beyond technical acceptability, lead time, and price for a goods procurement. But I'd like to throw out there that maybe there should be more soft cost, non-sort of tangible evaluation factors for goods too. The things that might have to do with the cost of quality, financial risk. You know, it isn't just a black or a white yes or a no. Let me throw out that this one I should have earlier, Tong, is in public procurement in general, to my understanding, it's very, very hard to buy from the lowest cost, technically acceptable and formally qualified bidder. You sort of have to buy from the lowest, given all those check boxes. Well, that is one difference I'll touch on. In private, if Fluor is doing business with ExxonMobil for a $5 billion oil refinery or whatever the project is, within the construct of ethics and legality, we can buy from whoever we want, right? And we can put in evaluation criteria, and many do, even public sector, I know that that's sometimes done, is you're free to buy from any or none of the bidders. And that's a pretty standard clause in instructions to bidders. Well, we do sometimes. We believe then in a procurement, in an eval, that it's okay to spend more money if we do a good job of doing our homework and showing a reason why we should be spending more money. It does happen all the time. I love that because I think that's a smart way to evaluate, and maybe we have more freedom in private to do so than in public. I think that's sort of a lesson of the rule makers is if you're doing your job, it's not as simple as just buying from the lowest price, technically acceptable, qualified bidder. So that's maybe a difference to flip it around, one of the differences. But in general, I'll still go back to there's more similarities than there are differences.
Yeah, let's talk about the similarities between public and private in terms of established project bidders lists, the number of bidders, including solicitations, etc.
What I saw in Bonfire examples and templates and that which you showed me is I believe public has a tendency to have more invited bidders than private. Maybe a reason for that is our desire, at least in the industry I always worked or am still working, to do a very thorough bidders list generation workflow. Maybe those are the wrong words to use, but we would much rather have there be fewer bidders, but all of which we should be willing to buy from. So the work we spend in qualification and the adoption of a real project bidders list that's solid, you might go from a dozen or more that could fulfill a procurement, that could make the product satisfactorily, and you might have there be 5 that you'd solicit a major package from. And from what I saw on the examples of some of your customers is there's much more than that are invited to bid for a public procurement on average. So I might counter that maybe more bidders list work would make that number go down quite a bit, which would then be a better avenue to take because there's less time you spend and less money evaluating so many bidders. But that was a difference that was interesting to me too. But then if I flip that around on myself and I say, how many times have I seen going out to 6 or 8 bidders and you get bids back and you go through the short list that takes no time at all because you would never want to buy from half of them. Well, there's something inherently wrong with sending an RFQ or an RFP out to companies you have no intention of buying from. That to me is sort of a chink in the armor of us doing our really good job in support of the goals of what it is we're working on. We should be willing to buy from any that we send an inquiry to. I know that from the training we've gotten on using Bonfire, there's ways to basically come up with a bidders list on the fly. If you want to buy glass for a building, or if you want to buy some kind of pretty much basic commodity, you could search for and get qualified bidder names using the tool or even using other resources and not have done any pre-qualification work. Well, I'd almost say, then what homework have you done that you consider they're qualified to bid on your package? And if the public sector does more of that than private, like I said a minute ago, I think that is a difference to note. But I'd almost want to prod public sector to think about that a little bit too. And there's no regulation that I know of that says you can't do more homework and get more well-developed bidders lists before you go and issue an inquiry. Because that just is what it is, whether you have the time and the money and the resources to do it. I think it's a best practice that maybe the private sector does a little bit more than the public. But I love the philosophy that you should be willing to buy from anybody you send an inquiry to. That is a standard of almost fairness that we should hold regardless of what some rule says. That just seems to me to be a fairer way to treat potential sellers in the market, either way.
Yeah. Let's shift focus a little bit in terms of the instructions for an RFP or an RFQ. How does that compare between a private and public opportunity?
I was interested to see just how similar they were. Some were of really great high quality. Some were sort of medium, because we don't have a lot of time to really develop that. We need to get things out on the street and you need to get things bought, but very similar in construct, the order, the outline, the level of detail, public and private. Very interested to see that. That was a big lesson for me. I think in the public sector, there is probably quite a bit more evaluation criteria, whether for goods or services, than in private. That goes to show that maybe public, through acquisition regulations or otherwise, has embraced the concept of scoring and weighting and doing a interestingly thorough job of including other factors than the private sector. So it goes in favor of saying good job, the more the better, because you can't go wrong with having there be another evaluation criteria. It can only give you another point of data to make your decision, whether it's scored or not. It could just be a point of interest that something is, one company is different than the other. Say it's not even scored, or if it's weighted very differently from one company to the other. It can only help you by making you aware of something that might just influence your purchasing decision. So that was something interesting that I saw, is instructions to bidders and RFQ, RFP documentation. While similar in most ways, public had more criteria than private. So I would like for anybody that'll listen to CSC and what I'm doing in this mining work is more is better. And we're going to push for even more of those soft evaluation criteria too, if only to give us more data points to feel more comfortable with our purchasing recommendation.
Right. Okay. So my final question for you is, how do you believe ethics and fairness and regulations compare across business sectors or types of businesses?
Well, maybe you start with back to why there are ethics and fairness and regulations and laws that govern this kind of thing. We all, as supply chain professionals, in a lot of ways hold the keys to the ethics and fairness door. We are sort of the governor in most organizations, and in my opinion, my experience, of being the group that ensures we do it well and do it right. If we left procurement or contracting to designers and architects and engineers, many would probably say we're asking for it because they designed something around the favorite, and that's not fair to others, right? So where did all of that start? It started in the public sector through acquisition regulations, right? The infamous FARs and all of the other municipal rules that other agencies and entities impose, because there's a public standard that should be more stringent, in my opinion, than private. Why? the relationship between how business is done and the laws of a municipality or government are, to me, critically important. You can't be a ethical and fair country or state or province or whatever and do business in a dirty way. They just don't jive. It's like the core of what a place is how it transacts business with its people, with its companies, et cetera. So that's where all of that, in my view, got formalized, because it's the basis of everything in a dirty place or a clean place. You got to regulate in a lot of ways. So here along comes private enterprise, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and everything. And you say, well, you're not telling me what to do. You think unions, think all of that. You're not telling me what to do. I'm in this to make money. This is capitalism, and no government's telling me how I'm going to transact my business because I'm private. Even if I'm a publicly traded company, like my former company, I'm still private and you can't tell me what to do. Well, I really think that the dawn of the early 1900s and union strife and all of that made big business rethink how much should we be bound by an ethical standard and a legal and a moral standard. Well, we should be bound by it because we have a corporate reputation to uphold, whereas a country has a national reputation to uphold. And so for the very same reason, procedures in private enterprise that govern that were constructed that are quite harsh in many instances. Can a buyer be fired for doing the wrong thing? Of course. And that's in corporate, private industry, corporate rules and regulations and the procedures I was always bound by. One of my first department meetings, way back when in California, like I mentioned earlier, I remember it so well because it really, really was dramatic to me. Big department meeting, the department manager, the boss gets up and gives us a talk on ethics. And said, so even if you haven't actually been involved, if it's even perceived that you're involved in something unethical, you're shown the door. Doesn't matter if it's doesn't matter if it's real or not. If it's perceived, that means a client of ours may believe it. If it's perceived that you're involved, you took some expensive gift or somebody bought you a weekend in Tahoe or whatever, for maybe getting on a bidders list, not happening here. And that was a private, large, publicly traded company. Didn't matter what the government said. We were still going to hold ourselves to the same level of accountability. So in my heart of hearts, it doesn't matter whether public or private. We're still the keepers of the ethical transaction for goods and services within our companies or our entities. And we're going to be the holders of that, continue to be so. So we have, signature authority matrices that govern who can spend what. Supply chain and procurement is the only people that can commit money. We have so many checks and balances and audit requirements that we're bound by, even in the private sector, that while we don't have acquisition regulations also governing us, I think in a lot of ways it feels like we do, and it doesn't really matter. So as long as we keep being held to that high standard, I think we do business in a lot of the same ways. And so to Bonfire, as evaluation criteria, could we use Bonfire in a really customized way, even if we were having there be fewer evaluation criteria with fewer things scored? Yes, if we choose to do that. We may choose to do that in this mining venture that we expect some clients soon for that. Could we also turn around and take a lead from the public sector and craft evaluation criteria or even instructions to bidders and RFQ, RFP documentation and forms of contracting like public? Of course we can. We can do evals exactly like a public sector company does using Bonfire if we choose to do that. So when we came looking for a tool set to use and get out of the Excel template world like everybody had done for so long and still is doing, we looked, and what caught our eye in Bonfire was that customization and the ability to keep it simple, as well as the ability to get creative, like really creative. If the client comes to us and says, I'm interested in much more than just price, we say, got you covered. Because not only do we believe in the value of doing that, but we have a tool set that we can then turn around into concise recommendations for award whether scored or not, it's all customizable, and we can present that to ourselves and present that to our clients in ways that all your customers do. And so even if we're a bit of an oddball user of Bonfire today, compared to your average user and customer, that's a good thing. It makes us smile. Like, great. We've gotten creative, and I haven't tried to mimic some same old Excel bid tab that I always used for decades. Let's get modern, let's get clean, and let's get creative using that functionality that we can within the tool set. So anyway, that's a ramble, but ethics first and foremost is a great point to make. But without regard to ethics, we can get as creative as we want in terms of evals within the tool.
Right. Jeff, I want to give you an opportunity now to just give like a summary, if you could, if you have any way to wrap everything you said in a nice little bow between private and public.
I wish that there were more chance for supply chain professionals to be able to be viewed the ways I've tried to describe them, Tong, as I could go be plopped into a public sector procurement world and be able to succeed. And because of my functional knowledge and experience, without regard to there being a big difference between public and private. I'll give you an analogy. Same in my background and my world, you might have a power background. You've always worked on power plant projects. That's just what you do. You know the suppliers, you know the lingo and the terminology and all of that. Well, to many companies, if I had a power background, could I be plopped into a infrastructure job in roads, bridge, light rail, and all that? And the typical reaction is, no way. Jeff's not going on my new toll road job. No way in hell is he going to be allowed on my team because he's always worked power, and that's a whole different thing. Or same is true for comparing any two. And I guess I'm just still this idealist after all these years is I go, stop it. That's just not true. Same is true for public and private, in my opinion. Not because I did that one job at the start of my career. That there are still so many things that we do the same, and we should be proud of that as a function. Could a person working for a county or a city or Washington, D.C. or any capital in the world be able to be plopped into a solar renewables power project to do large scale, complex, custom mechanical engineering buying, mechanical product buying? Yes. Why not? And I think the more that we might embrace those similarities versus differences, like my analogy, I think the better we'll be as a function. There's always going to be some difference to everything that we do, but the core of the work is the core of the work. And I think we should be proud that those of us that have had at least enough, training to get to know what the core of our work really is. The core of our work is fairness, competition, negotiation, the legalities that govern the transaction, all of that collaborative stuff with the supplier or the contractor, and all of those things that need to be audited against and well documented. That's the core of our work. Can't tell me that any of your public customers could argue much with that because it's the core of our work regardless. And so I think as Bonfire, you're pretty well placed to be able to serve various customers because that core is able to be done within Bonfire. So I think others like us that have tried to get creative here are going to see some advantage in that too if they just realize that the core of our work applies regardless. That's sort of a way to summarize maybe this conversation too. And, I'd certainly welcome any feedback or discussion about that with anybody that might care to reach out. I'm certainly willing, very, very willing to do that with anybody that'd like to talk shop about this. And I hope that this sparks some interest, Tong, from the audience. And I really do. And that maybe even some discussions could take place.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm already fascinated just hearing you talk about this stuff. And you're right. At the beginning of the show, you set out the mission to show the similarities of private versus public. And from our discussion, it really seems like there are more similarities than differences. Of course, there's differences. It's two sides of the same coin. They're heads or tails. There's the slight difference in patterns, but ultimately, we kind of do the same job in slightly different ways, right? And I wonder, And this is a surprise question to you. Is there a way to build a bridge between private and public? Because it really seems like it's either, oh, you're private, then, you don't get to play on this side of the field, or vice versa. How can we kind of collaborate with one another and share knowledge with one another so there isn't one of these like, oh, you're on the other side, we don't play ball with each other?
The first thing that comes to mind with that question is, and not just because we're talking and you work for Bonfire and all, but isn't it true that systems and tools have begun to be a bridge between things? And again, I guess it's why it's the first thing going to my mind is it breaks down, and even COVID and everything being remote, like you and I are remote right now from each other, it breaks down walls. And I think a lot of us that have our eyes opened that, oh, that's a tool set that I didn't know existed, and maybe it could apply to me too. And we're seeing, or we're learning more than we did before, because we weren't just in a building with one way to do business and we had no idea what our competitor was doing. Or, you're talking public, a municipality of whatever kind, no idea what the county in the other state, how they're doing their business per se. And I have no idea what the company, 2 blocks down the road is doing and how they're doing it, because I'm in a wall and I'm in a cube or an office and I got a tool set they're making me use. Well, now we're learning from how other people do their work much more than we ever did before. It's why we stumbled upon Bonfire. I went looking, and it didn't take long, because everything's fast these days. And you go looking and you go, gosh, I could have chosen these more traditional tools to do this kind of work or stayed in the Excel world, but I quickly got a solution. And I think so a bridge to your question, a bridge could be solutions and software and tools could become a bridge across those valleys. It's true also for engineering and design tools. It's true for project management and scheduling tools. Yeah, the world's getting modern. And I think that we're going to see maybe a consolidation of tools that we use or platforms that we're on, instead of all of these same old, disparate, non-integrated tools that we're all very used to that don't talk to one another. Well, in my world of big process plants, we must provide for our clients digital twins of all that design data. Every bit of data on a project used to be given in binders that took a whole room up. Right now, the deliverable is a twin of what it is we just constructed. Everything about it, every little teeny bit of material data, it's all part of that twin. To do that, we can't have these disparate systems that don't talk to each other. Well, that's going to erode all these islands, I think, Tong, of islands. Things need you know what I'm trying to say? Things needing bridges over time because of this modernity, this way that we're now doing business. And I think that's really, really exciting to be a part of that, instead of just being the traditional, no, I'm in public and I do business this way and these are the tools I use and there's no way I could do anything different because those guys are different. That's going to be eroded over time, and that's good for everybody, in my opinion. Yeah,
the takeaways that I got from that was technology is the future, and we're all friends here.
Well, sure, but they're all, this is all big project, big construction space that we're talking about. So say we're building a stadium for a city or a school for a county or whatever it is. Doesn't matter. They're all projects. That's the point. They're all projects. They all have design information. They all have procurement of goods and services. They all have concrete and steel and rebar and electrical cable and lights and control systems. They're all projects. And so I always like going back to ethics too, really is they all have a way of doing our business as supply chain, regardless, even if a public sector has other governing rules. They're not that different than non-public. And so the core of what we do, back to that again too, the core of what we do, we should be proud of who we are contributing to that really tight, modern, thorough way of doing that core business, regardless. I just believe in that so much.
Yeah. We'd like to close out the show with a number one piece of advice that you'd like to share for people starting their career in public procurement. But, let's just say starting their career in procurement in general. Obviously, when you started, you are still doing procurement to this day because you love it so much. What is the advice for people who are kind of on the fence of like, I'm not sure, like I'm just starting now. I don't really know what direction I should head.
I would say that the most important thing or piece of advice I would give the person starting out today is strive to be more than just the transactor of business. Because especially in today's world and as your career goes forward, the transactor can be easily outsourced, can be automated. We have to be everything that supply chain is, no matter where we work or what kind of organization we work for. So strive to add value outside of just the transaction. And there's a lot of space for that too. Our world focuses on construction-driven execution. I think a lot of public also focuses on the customer is construction, the job site, etc. Well, we have to embrace that our work starts before the requisition hits our desk. And I'm pause for effect because that's really important, I think. Our work as supply chain and procurement must start before the requisition hits our desk. We got to be involved in supplier pre-qualification, material design data to help construction know how those work packages are going to be able to be constructed, not just flooding a job site with equipment and material and letting them figure it out. Being part of a material planning, many companies call, being material planners before we're buyers. We as supply chain should step up and take ownership for doing that and not leave that up to superintendents and project managers and engineers to do that for us. So my advice to the new buyer is get ready for the ride, because if you think that being the best buyer you can be is all there is to this career, your job's going to go away and that will be outsourced. And what'll take its place is what I was just describing as the view of supply chain. Across industries, that's what we need to be, because, robotic process automation will replace the actual buy. And we have to be planners more and at our core more than anything else too. That's the advice I think I'd give. And this is only in the last 10 years, really, in my view, has this really taken off. And a lot of companies are embracing that it's much more than the thing we used to call the purchasing group. And that's how we began. And it's an evolution. Every few years or every few blank, more little stuff gets added and strategy gets added and planning gets added. And get ready for that is my advice. We have to do more than the robots can. Yes, I think, we do. Right? We do. That's real. That's not science fiction anymore, man. It's happening. Well, Jeff, this has been such a lovely conversation. Thanks so much for taking your time to chat with me today. I definitely feel as though I've learned a lot, and I know our audience has too. If people want to get in touch with you to just have a conversation with you, where can they do that? Maybe the easiest way to hook up is LinkedIn. So there's a couple Jeff Houtzes. I think I have a distant relative in Pennsylvania, but I don't know. But look for Jeff Houtz. Look for maybe that CSC. You can find me on LinkedIn pretty easy. Would welcome that too. Probably the easiest way is just send out a message or a LinkedIn request, and we can start a conversation on the side and exchange contact info. I'm most happy to carve out some time and talk shop with anybody that would like to, for sure. Fantastic. And how do you spell your last name for the people at home? Yeah. Thanks forgot it's a podcast. So Jeff is the first name and Houtz is the last name. It's Houtz as in zebra. So Jeff Houtz, and please do reach out and we'll see where the conversation goes.
Yes, please do that. Jeff is an amazing person to talk to. And as you can tell from this podcast, he's very passionate. And for the people at home, you might not know, but his first name is spelled Jeff, because now there's 3 other spellings of Jeff now too.
There are, the American way, just Jeff. But I hope that you do reach out. And Tong, I really appreciate the chance to talk with you. And it's a great subject. And we're glad to be exposed now to Bonfire and to be using it in the ways we're going to do it. It's great.
I'm so happy to hear that. And just so people at home know, I did not pay Jeff to say all these nice things about Bonfire. He just did. And that's lovely. And that means a lot to us and a lot to me. So this has been another episode of Inside Public Procurement. Thanks again, Jeff, for being on the podcast, and hope to see you again.
Thanks, Hong. Thanks again.
Procurement professionals like you are the lifeblood of public sector organizations, dedicated not only to supporting your agency, but the constituents you serve. That's why we've created the Inside Public Procurement podcast here at Bonfire, a unique place where you can share stories and discuss the topics that matter to public procurement pros. From digitization and the future of public procurement to ensuring a fair and transparent process, we're all about finding new strategies to help your agency succeed. Join us at gobonfire.com to learn more. You've been listening to Inside Public Procurement by Bonfire. If you like what you've heard, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you have an idea for an episode or want to come on as a guest, email us at hello@gobonfire.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.